What's up guys, Asian here with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Magicka Nightblade. So the Magicka Nightblade is still a very strong Magicka DPS class in Greymoor with the drop in Mag Decay DPS. Mag Nightblades are actually very competitive with the top Magicka DPS spots, particularly when you have to play at ranged, where Mag Decays obviously are going to fall behind just due to the fact that they need to pretty much stay within melee range in order to make the most use out of their class dots. Nightblades do have a reputation of having a very involved rotation though, just because of the bow proc. You can of course make it a little bit more static by just sort of tying abilities in together and ignoring the bow proc altogether in actual raid environments, but to push out the most amount of DPS, Magicka Nightblades are going to need to do a fully dynamic rotation, which might be a little bit more difficult for those of you guys who might have physical impairments that prevent you from bar swapping or light attacking very easily. So just something to keep in mind if you intend on playing a Magicka Nightblade DPS. So, like the rest of our build videos, this video will just be going over skills and the rotation itself. If you're interested in knowing what gear I'm running, there is a link to the Magicka DPS gear video in the upper right-hand corner. So for this video specifically, we're just going to be going over skills as well as the rotation itself. Let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to show you guys two different skill setups right now, one for a vampire and one for a non-vampire. So the vampire setup does require you to be at melee range because we will be using blood for blood as our main spammable. If you need to play at range and you're a vampire, you can of course swap it out with something like Force Pulse or Swallow Soul or Elemental Weapon. And if you're not a vampire, you would just be using Force Pulse, Elemental Weapon, or Swallow Soul, pretty much what you would normally run in Storm. But for our vampire setup, we are running Impale, Blood for Blood, Crippling Grasp, Merciless Resolve, Inner Light, and Soul Harvest. You can use the Vampire Ultimate if you would like. That is Swarming Scion. I got a little bit less DPS, and I'll show you that parse when we finish up the rotation, just so you guys can see the difference in DPS between running Swarming Scion versus Soul Harvest on the front bar. You can also go with the other morph if you need a little bit more sustain, because as a vampire you will have a little bit of a hit to your sustain, just because your abilities, non-vampire abilities, do cost a little bit more, so you can run Incapacitating Strike for the Reeve passive, which gives you the Magicka and stamina back. You won't be doing as much damage with Incapacitating Strike. As you can see here, you're dropping about 1.4k DP damage in total, just because Incapacitating Strike does not scale as well off of your CP passives, but you still get the additional damage done bonus, and it's not that big of a drop, so it might be worth running Incapacitating Strike if you feel like you need additional sustain here. On our back bar, we are running Dark Shade, Unstable Wall, Twisting Path, Structured Entropy. You can swap this out for Siphoning attacks if you'd prefer for more sustain. Both of these work to offset the health cost of running Blood for Blood. Of course, you will also be getting healed in a raid, so that will also offset the health cost of Blood for Blood, but for self-sustain purposes, Siphoning attacks and Structured Entropy should be more than enough to get you up, keep you at full health when you're using Blood for Blood. Then we have Barbed Trap for Minor Force. You can replace this with the Sigil Order line, either Raise Against Time or Challenge Acceleration. Challenge Acceleration is going to usually be the better option just because it lasts for a longer period of time, so you don't need to give up as many global cooldowns in order to use Challenge Acceleration versus Race Against Time. Then we have Soul Harvest again. We need this for the 10% additional crit damage that we're getting from the Hemorrhage passive under the Assassination line. Now for our non-vampire setup or our ranged setup, you have a couple of options for spambles, pretty much all of which I've mentioned. Swallow Soul fits that really nice middle ground between doing good damage and also self-sustaining your health, so really good spamble there. Can also run Force Pulse, regardless of whether you're running the Asylum Staff or not. Force Pulse is still a pretty nice spamble. It does have a little bit of cleave. There is obviously a condition to the cleave damage, but it is fairly easy to meet. So running Force Pulse does give you a little bit of additional cleave compared to running Swallow Soul and the other spamble, which is Elemental Weapon. Elemental Weapon is fairly useful because it does guarantee either Burning, Concussed, or Chilled, so it could be useful in order to get better off-balance uptime, minor vulnerability uptime with the Concussed proc chance, but it is going to be a little bit more expensive to run compared to something like Force Pulse or Swallow Soul. So you can see here 2,900 Magicka compared to Swallow Soul's 2500 and Force Pulse's 2500 Magicka as well. So just keep that in mind. Your sustain is going to suffer a little bit if you decide to run Elemental Weapon instead of Force Pulse or Swallow Soul. I will also show you guys a parse, a non-vampire parse with Swallow Soul as well at the end, so you guys can compare DPS. Now, in terms of our rotation itself, going to demonstrate it first on the 3 million dummy. Like I mentioned, it is going to be a little bit of a dynamic rotation, and so in order to push out the most DPS, you will need to master your light weaving skills, and you will need to master the dynamic rotation. Now, you can, like I mentioned, tie abilities together and make a somewhat static rotation. So, for example, you could tie together Twisting Path and Unstable Wall because the durations are fairly close together. You would end up losing a little bit of damage on Twisting Path, and you would end up increasing, I should say decreasing your sustain because you would be overcasting Twisting Path, but you wouldn't have to be quite as dynamic. And in an actual raid environment where you have mechanics to play and AoEs to dodge, it might be more beneficial to tie these together instead of trying to rely on keeping an eye on your add-ons to maintain the full duration of Twisting Path and do a fully dynamic rotation. The option is up to you. Just remember that if you do decide to make it a little bit more static, you are going to lose a little bit of DPS. Generally speaking, the loss is not going to be that big, but it really depends on how much you try to simplify the rotation itself. The simpler you try to make the rotation, the less DPS you'll be able to pull just because you won't be getting as many bow procs off, which is a huge source of your damage as a Magicka Nightblade. So I always like to pre-buff here with Merciless Resolve. If you're running Siphoning attacks, make sure you pre-buff with Siphoning attacks as well. Then use whatever source of Minor Force you have, and then start off by applying all your back bar dots. And then depending on whether you want to do a dynamic or not, just go back and forth and just try to proc that bow proc as soon as you are able to get it. Obviously, you're going to be using potions on cooldown. And remember that your ultimate does cost a little bit more than usual as a vampire, because your vampire increased cost does also impact your ultimate cost as well. Now, I do want to take this time now to kind of talk about the bow proc itself. There is a way to do the bow proc, and there is a way to not do the bow proc. Basically, a right way and a wrong way, or rather, I should say, a less correct way. So remember that the bow proc requires you to have 5 light attacks in order to get the bow to proc. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the bow will proc like that, and you can fire it off. Now, what I see a lot of beginner Nightblades do is actually do 5 light attacks, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they get the bow proc, and then they do another light attack and shoot the bow. You're basically wasting 1 light attack this way. So in a weaving scenario, for example, if we do that, you're basically wasting that light attack. So basically what you want to do instead is once you hit 4, 3, 4, you want to light attack directly into the bow proc, because that 5th light attack you set off will activate your bow. So when you're weaving, it looks something like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, and then bow proc. That way you get the bow proc off faster, and you're not wasting one of your light attacks, which should be used to build up the next bow proc. So again, it looks like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, bow proc is what you should be doing. And then obviously once you get to execute, instead of running blood for blood or whatever your spam bull is, you just use Impale instead. And you just spam Impale. And then for your back bar dots to maintain during execute, you do want to maintain both Twisting Path, Unstable Wall, and Barbed Trap. So with that done, let's go ahead and do our rotation. So again, this is the vampire rotation, so we're running blood for blood. Nightblades should be able to sustain blood for blood fairly decently well. Your bow proc will heal you. If you're running entropy, entropy will heal you as well. If you're running siphoning attacks, your light attacks will heal you as long as you have siphoning up. So you shouldn't really have any issues sustaining blood for blood. Now, because of the increased cost, and with this particular bar setup, there is a chance you will need to heavy attack once or twice, potentially in a fight, depending on how long the fight is and your group support. Just remember that the trial dummy itself is not necessarily indicative of in-trial parses. We are missing a couple of debuffs and buffs from the dummy. We're missing things like Minor Courage, Zens, Martial Knowledge, for example, and we are missing some sustain options, so we are missing things like Siphoning of Blades, Hollow Fang, etc. That would help out our overall sustain. So just because you're running 1 or 2 heavy attacks on a dummy doesn't necessarily mean you will need to do so in an actual trial environment if you're running a semi-optimized group. So let's go ahead and get started. One piece of advice I will have for people is to try to line up your ultimate Soul Harvest with a bow proc, so that way you get the big bow proc hit. Sometimes it doesn't work out, but do try to make it so your bow proc goes off when the damage debuff is on from your ultimate. So you can see here that the Nightblade does require you to bar swap fairly often, especially if you want to maximize your bow procs, because you might be breaking reapplying dots in order to use your bow. You can see here with Blood for Blood, our sustain is not actually that bad, because Blood for Blood does use health as our casting resource. Where you might see the need for a heavy tag is going to be an execute, depending on how long execute is. See here, I'm breaking my back bar dot rotation a little bit in order to get that bow proc off. You might not necessarily be able to do that in an actual raid environment because you might be doing mechanics. In that instance, it's okay to hold on to the bow proc, because obviously staying alive and doing mechanics is more important than pushing your own personal DPS. Remember that trap does have an arm time, so you do want to cast it a little bit early. If you're using a add-on that track your dot durations, just make sure you're recasting it before it runs out, because of that 1.5 second cast time, essentially. Alright, we're getting close to execute, so again, in execute, you're going to maintain path, trap, and wall. You are still going to continue to use your bow proc. Right, so we're in execute, so again, path, wall, we're not going to be using entropy. Still going to be using our bow proc and execute. You can see here, this is where the sustain does start to hit, because you're not running Blood for Blood any longer. We're so close, we won't bother re-upping trap. And there we go. That is our parse here. You will notice that currently on the PTS, the trial dummy does not actually take into consideration any damage you do from Blood for Blood, so even though you see 77.9 on the chat screen, it is actually 86k that we managed to pull here. 86k here, so again, Blood for Blood is not counting, so if you do the math, take 86,067, subtract out the 8114, you would get this 77,951, roughly speaking. Comment metrics and the actual in-game DPS number don't really line up usually. But overall, you can see here, pretty good DPS. Light attacking is very important for Magicka DPS, making about a quarter of our DPS. Bow proc, very, very important here to maintain. You can see just how much damage it's able to pull here with a max hit of 113.5k. So really important to make sure we're getting as many bow procs off as we can, particularly in execute, because that is where we're going to be hitting that 113.5k crit here. I did say I would show you guys some of parses from alternative setups here. So this parse here was with the Swarming Scion morph, so that is the ultimate from the Vampire passive here. Pretty much same exact setup that I used here. The Swarming Scion actually doesn't do that much DPS. You can see here it does less than Zaan. The main reason why you'd be running more Swarming Scion is because of that max Magicka boost. You get 10% additional, 10k max Magicka boost. So our max Magicka is going to be 58.6 with a mean of 46.3 compared to here where our mean was 41.5. So we are getting essentially about 5k additional mean max Magicka. That does end up improving our damage here. So if you take a look at the max hits here, you can see they're a little bit lower. That part of it is due to the increase in max Magicka. That's why you'd run Swarming Scion here, one for the damage and then also for the additional max Magicka that you're getting. Not that bad, 84.8k or 84.8k here, so pretty decent, but obviously the Soul Harvest ended up pulling higher. And if you're running Swallow Soul as a spam build, you're going to pull lower. Just the way it is. 81k here with Swallow Soul here, doing significantly less DPS than Blood for Blood is. This setup is obviously going to be a little bit different here, but pretty much exactly the same. You will definitely want to run Siphoning attacks though if you're running Swallow Soul, because you're going to be using Magicka for Swallow Soul rather than Health or Blood for Blood, so you will need the additional sustain from Siphoning attacks. So Siphoning attacks is necessary if you're running Swallow Soul, Force Pulse, or Elemental Weapon as your spammable. Well, that pretty much concludes it for this build video. Hope you guys found this informative. If you guys have any questions at all, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.